After Brookmans Park in Hertfordshire, the North Regional Station, the second of the BBC's twin-wave high-power stations, was in the first stages of its construction at Moorside Edge by 1923. It was to serve the whole of the north of England and a large part of the Northern Midlands and North Wales. This is the story of the magnificent Moorside Edge transmitting station, and some tales and information you've hopefully never heard before. The BBC's engineers had to overcome difficulties in selecting a site for the North Regional Station. Perhaps the most harrowing for them was the argument that raged on between the BBC and local residents. The transmitter site is located in a place that reads as Slaithwaite. Slaithwaite isn't pronounced like this, however. Even the locals couldn't quite agree what was right. Some opted for Slathwaite, and others insist on Slowett. After much debate, argument and complaint, the BBC gave up and opted for the name Moorside Edge. Test work commenced over Christmas 1922 by using mobile transmitting and receiving stations. Before these stations mounted on lorries could set about the work of testing, a large number of suggested sites were inspected and considered. 4 of the sites were eventually selected for technical investigation by the mobile stations. They were Todmorden Moor, which was abandoned because nobody could seem to agree on the terms of the land purchase, a site near Rochdale which was found to be unsuitable technically because there were undue electrical losses, a low-lying site near Haywood which was tested mainly in order to compare the effect of the sites at greater altitudes, and Moorside Edge, which was eventually selected. The transmissions from the mobile transmitter were picked up in various parts of the north of England by the mobile receiver. The field strength was carefully measured, and from the measurements, a polar diagram was prepared to show the amount of energy sent out in every direction. In the case of the proposed Rochdale site, the polar diagram showed that location would be inefficient. Due to the large number of measurements necessary, and consequently the enormous number of miles to be travelled by the receiving van, the transmitter stayed from 4 to 6 weeks on each of the 4 sites. The Todmorden Moor site, between Bacup and Todmorden, was absolutely suitable, but after the engineers had concluded their work, a hitch occurred. 3 engineers, as well as motor drivers, were engaged on this work regularly from Christmas to June 1923. Whilst there, they encountered harsh weather conditions. The aerial was blown down several times, and the transmitter lorry was almost buried in snowdrifts. The lorry was heavy, and on several occasions there was a great trouble in moving it owing to the frozen roads. On one occasion, the lorry got bogged down, and a contractor who was called in to help free it was involved in an accident and sustained 3 broken ribs. Because of these hitches, the Moorside Edge site, which was 1,000 feet above sea level, was considered about right, taking everything into consideration. The tests from this site gave satisfactory results, the polar diagram being reasonably symmetrical. The wavelengths allotted for Moorside Edge were 479.2 metres for the Northern Regional Programme and 301.5 metres for the National Programme. These were at that time used by 5GB at Daventry and Aberdeen respectively. On 479.2 metres, Moorside Edge was expected to have an extensive service area, using its 500-foot high aerial, and there was 50 kilowatts of power to play with if necessary. 301.5 metres wouldn't cover such a large area, although a maximum power of 50 kilowatts was available here too. The actual service areas of the 2 frequencies were still unknown at this point, but it was certain that the radiation would be stronger to the east and west rather than the north and south. Moorside Edge was to obtain its programme feeds via landline from Manchester and Leeds, with the London feed arriving via Leeds. Moorside Edge was technically more advanced than Brookmans Park, and numerous differences were included which made this new station at that time quite unique and groundbreaking. One new advancement in technology was that every room at Moorside Edge had a series of coloured signal lights on the wall. Each light had a significance. If an engineer got into difficulties with a faulty piece of apparatus, he pressed a button, and in every room a bell would ring and one of the lights flashed, allowing help to come to the rescue. 4 6-cylinder diesel engines at Moorside Edge each gave 345 horsepower at 335 revolutions per minute to drive the main dynamos. Those at Brookmans Park gave 300 horsepower at 300 rpm. The Moorside Edge masts stood on porcelain insulators, which completely insulated them from earth, and each mast could be tuned to minimise its screening effect on the transmission. A very necessary precaution at Moorside Edge over Brookmans Park was the ability to switch the main generators direct to the aerials. This was done to melt any ice that was forming on them. The 4 diesel engines in the powerhouse were used to drive 4 dynamos which generated 230 volts at 2700 amps. When both transmitters were working, 3 dynamos supplied the current, with the 4th being in standby. The 75 tons of crude oil for the engines was housed in tanks outside the powerhouse, and the exhaust gases were used to heat the transmitter building. Next to the powerhouse was a room that contained the accumulators. In the event of a complete breakdown of the power plant, they were capable of running one of the transmitters. The generator room contained motor generators driven by the current from the powerhouse, and they generated the various currents required for the transmitters, ranging from the 12,000 volt high tension currents to the 15 to 20 volt low tension currents for lighting the filaments of the transmitting valves. Each transmitter had 36 valves, each cooled by water, 200,000 gallons of it. When it was completed after a lengthy period of construction, which attracted regular crowds that watched the steel behemoth rise skywards, a team of 20 engineers were employed to maintain and monitor Moorside Edge. The 2 transmitters were brought onto the air in gradual stages. At first, the test transmissions were outside of the normal program hours. Gradually, the periods of transmissions were extended until a full daily service was started on May 17, 1931. The North Regional Transmitter on 626 kHz was the first to start testing, and consequently the first to give regular programs. Its programs were partly relayed from London and partly produced in the Northern region. The Northern studios at Manchester and Leeds contributed the majority of the material on this frequency. The national programme on 995 kHz was relayed from London, of course, and after a period of testing, the full service began on July 12, 1931. The North Regional Transmitter was changed to 625 kHz from 626 kHz on November 27, 1932, and changed again to 668 kHz on July 15, 1934. On this date also, the national programme frequency changed from 995 kHz to 1013 kHz, before moving again to 1149 kHz on the 17th of February 1935. On the 1st of September 1939, the BBC merged the 2 programmes into one national service from London. The reasons given included the need to prevent enemy aircraft from using differentiated output from the regional programme transmitters as navigational beacons. To this end, the former regional transmitters were synchronized in chains on initially 2 frequencies, 668 kHz in the south and 767 kHz in the north, with an additional chain of low-powered transmitters known as Group H on 1474 kHz appearing later. Consequently, 668 kHz from Moorside Edge was reassigned to the new home service and 1149 kHz closed. By March 1941, the 668 kHz service received 2 new 150 kW transmitters, and a new 50 kW transmitter was installed for an upcoming launch. July 29, 1945 saw the BBC resume peacetime operation with the launch of the new light programme on 1149 kHz and the North Home service on 668 kHz. The BBC Third programme, a national station produced and broadcast from 1946 until 1967 when it was replaced by BBC Radio 3, was launched at Moorside Edge on the 29th of September 1946. It didn't last long, however, and was closed down on November 18, 1947. Moorside Edge was often itself subject to poor weather conditions. During the winter of 1947, engineers were constantly digging trenches to get through the snowdrifts, and 40-gallon drums of oil had to be hauled on sledges across the fields from the main road. They often had to plough through drifts to relieve the marooned shift of engineers at the station, and vans could only often get within 3 miles, so the remaining journey had to be made on foot. In one storm, the wind was so strong it lifted up a group of hen huts and threw them into the station, smashing the windows of the transmitter hall. The feeders to the national aerial were all broken, along with the lamp brackets on the main switchboard, leading to half a day off the air while repairs were conducted. Engineers worked tirelessly on a windswept moorside edge to repair gale damage to the aerial on the main North Regional transmitter in November 1949. Breakdowns during the 11th of November Northern programme were caused by strain on a feeder cable strung on poles between the main station buildings and the 500-foot transmitter mast. By dawn, the replacement was complete, and the North Regional programmes were once again being broadcast from the aerial. To cope with the ever-increasing numbers of broadcast stations and their increasing mutual interference, successive frequency plans were negotiated between countries. This was known as the Copenhagen Frequency Plan of 1948. Therefore, on the 15th of March 1950, the North Home Service changed to 692 kHz and the Light programme to 1214 kHz from Moorside Edge. On the evening of Tuesday the 14th of March, normal broadcasting ceased as engineers started a race against the clock to strip down the transmitters and reassemble them in readiness for the frequency changes. Rehearsals of the works were conducted in the week running up to the switchover to ensure split-second timings. These works involved installing extra crystal drives which would operate simultaneously on the old and new frequencies. Once the transmitter was stabilised, the old crystal drive was dispersed and Moorside Edge was live on its new frequency. On the 9th of April 1952, the aerial was struck by lightning and some damage was caused. Engineers switched over to a low-power standby transmitter while a condenser that was destroyed by the strike was replaced. Within 36 minutes, normal operations had resumed. In March 1952, many complaints were received by the GPO, the BBC and local MPs that reported that the Home Service was being wiped out by a Russian transmitter. One MP wrote to the Soviet administration on the 4th of March but received no reply. After that, a second Russian transmitter came on the air, but the protests from UK officials remained unanswered. In November 1958, East Germany launched a high-power transmitter that was on the same frequency as the Home Service from Moorside Edge. The interference worsened in the months that followed, and was especially bad during the evenings. MPs were flooded with letters of complaints from their constituents, and both the GPO and the BBC said there was little they could do. The fact that the source of the interference was in eastern Germany ruled out any direct approach to the broadcasting authorities, but representations were made through the Foreign Office. All the BBC could advise was for listeners to switch to VHF services instead. Similarly, in 1966, Radio Albania began causing major interference to the Light programme from both Brookmans Park, Newcastle and Moorside Edge. Again, the lack of diplomatic relations with Albania at that time made the situation hopeless, and any communication had to be made with Albania through the French government. The Post Office wrote to Radio Albania on a technical level but received no reply. The next major frequency change took place on the 30th of September 1967, when the Light programme on 1214 kHz was reassigned to Radio 1 and the North Home Service on 692 kHz was reassigned to Radio 4. In 1970, a new aerial system was brought into use. What this was exactly isn't clear, and in 1973, Radio 4's power was increased from 150 kilowatts to 300 kilowatts. In the storms of the night of August 13, 1975, Moorside Edge suffered another lightning strike, causing a brief service interruption. The Geneva Plan of 1975 entered into force on November 23, 1978, and although its intended lifespan was only until 1989, it's still valid, with small modifications by mutual coordination between countries today, and compliance has been far more widespread. Most existing European radio stations were required to change their broadcasting frequencies following the implementation of the plan. In most cases, the changes were slight, less than 5 kHz, but were more drastic in some cases, particularly in the UK, where all BBC national stations moved to a new wavelength or band. However, the increased number of radio services and reduction in most cases of interference to radio signals, particularly at night time, was considered by most broadcasters to be worth the initial inconvenience. By this time, Moorside Edge was carrying radios 1, 2 and 3, and these changes meant that Radio 3 moved to 1215 kHz from 1214 kHz, and Radio 2 moved on to 909 kHz, with Radio 1 on 1089 kHz. The frequency changes were the starting date for a lot of engineering and replacement work up and down the country, and they led to a complete rebuild of Moorside Edge. This rebuild included re-erecting the masts, building 5 aerial tuning houses, a mast-base building, and an electricity substation. The plans announced in November 1981 came at a time when Moorside Edge was long overdue modernisation. By July 1985, Colne Valley's most prominent landmark for more than 50 years had disappeared with the demolition of the main building. It was replaced with the new, smaller building we see today. Nearly £3 million was spent on transforming the station, which had seen few changes since it opened in 1931. 2 new 500-foot masts instead of the original 3 now radiated signals, and automated equipment gave extra power for Radio 1, 2 and 3. Radio 2's power had been increased from 100 kilowatts to 200 kilowatts, and Radio 3's power from 50 kilowatts to 100 kilowatts. The original 20 engineers on site when it opened had increased to a workforce of 37, which rose to a peak of nearly 70 in 1945 when it switched to round-the-clock operations. Since then, the number of staff was steadily reduced, and by the time of the rebuild, there was only a handful of engineers who were phased out completely in the next few years. On the 27th of August 1990, the 909 kHz transmitter was reassigned to Radio 5. On the 28th of February 1992, Radio 3 on 1215 kHz was shut down altogether. Virgin Radio launched on the same frequency on the 30th of April 1993, and on the 30th of June 1994, Radio 1 on 1080 kHz was closed. February the 14th, 1995, saw Talk Radio launch on 1089 kHz. Talk Sport launched on the 17th of January 2000 on the Talk Radio frequency and still radiates from Moorside Edge today. Radio 5 radiates from the masts themselves as a half-wave antenna. The antiphase wire antennas either side of the second mast are for Talk Sport and Absolute Radio. Radio 5 Live still continues to this day on 909 kHz, although Virgin Radio, which later became Absolute Radio, ceased transmissions on 1215 kHz in January 2023. In February 2025, TalkSport was granted permission from Ofcom to turn off 7 of its 18 AM transmitters, leaving Moorside Edge on the air for now. However, the BBC are planning to close all of their AM transmitters in the next 12 months, and with no clear deadline delay in sight, Moorside Edge, the snoozing giant relieved of most of its duties, will head deeper into its twilight years.